From the time of Victoria's founding in June of 1843 until 1915, when water from Sooke Lake was first delivered to the city, the population had risen from a handful to around 35,000. Prior to the city's connecting to Sooke Lake in 1915, difficulties with water supply had increased from mere inconvenience to a very serious problem. In 1842, Sir James Douglas led an expedition from Fort Vancouver on the Columbia River to find a suitable location for a Hudson's Bay trading post on southern Vancouver Island. He examined 3 harbors, Sooke, Esquimalt, and Camosac, now Victoria. Of these, he chose Camosac as the most advantageous, rejecting the first 2 for various reasons that included the scarcity of fresh water. But Camosac, which a year later became Fort Victoria, had the same problem. The Royal Engineers noted on their inspection of the place in 1845, quote, "This fort has lately been established. It is badly situated with regard to water and position." Obviously, the newly established Fort Victoria could not exist without a reliable water supply. Exploration located a source on higher ground that became known as Spring Ridge. At first, water was transported to the fort in barrels. Eventually, the trail became a road over which wagons could be driven. Spring Ridge belonged, like all other land in the region, to the Hudson's Bay Company, but was treated as public property. This was formally affirmed by James Douglas, the chief factor of the HBC and governor of the colony, when in 1858 he rejected the proposal of private companies to purchase the springs for commercial use. By 1861, the HBC had sold much of the property within the town to private holders. In that year, it undertook to auction off its lands in what were then Victoria's suburbs. No one had imagined that this would include the springs, but it soon turned out to have been sold to George Hunter Carey, who is the Attorney General for the United Colonies of Vancouver Island and British Columbia. In addition, John J. Cochran, a local surveyor and realtor, was part of that. When the new owners posted a guard at the springs to prevent carriers from taking water except for a fee, the citizens of Victoria were outraged. The anger became still more intense when a fence was erected. A group of citizens, including water carriers, went up one night and tore it down and burned it. A water carrier named Montrose was taken before the authorities and fined for his part in the act. Colony's Surveyor General, Joseph Pemberton, then declared an injunction against the sale until the matter could be decided by the Privy Council in London. The decision, based on Douglas's earlier declaration, went against the owners, and the springs remained public for the time being. As a result of the gold rushes on the Fraser River in 1858 and in the Caribou in 1861, Victoria, being then the chief port of access to the interior, began to grow rapidly. A population of about 300 in 1858 had swelled to approximately 4,000 by 1874. Transport of water by wagon alone became increasingly impractical. In 1863, 2 entrepreneurs, John Coe and Thomas Martin, dug a shaft at Spring Ridge and installed a pump to extract the water in greater quantities, using nearby Harris Pond as a reserve for the drier months in late summer. They then built a pipeline into the town using 12-foot long logs that were hollowed out and attached end to end to extend from the spring to an outlet on Government Street, from where deliveries were made by wagon. By 1864, Coe and Martin formed the Spring Ridge Water Works Company and began adding distribution pipes in the city. Already in 1869, it was evident that the spring and pond would soon be incapable of supplying Victoria's growing population. In the spring of 1872, a prominent civil engineer, Thomas A. Bulkley, was engaged to study the question of how to provide adequate water for the city. Bulkley submitted his report in October 1872. He was highly critical of the then, quote, insufficient supply to the town. He noted that a large proportion of houses have their own wells. In the generality of these, the water is very hard. In several, the water is unfit for use, as must always be the case in a city in which cesspools are the rule. But Bulkley was particularly critical of the services provided by the Spring Ridge Water Company. Where then should they go? Bulkley considered Gold Stream, Colwood Stream, Mill Stream, Prospect Lake, Dead Man's River, and Colquitt's River. Colquitt's River was itself not attractive, but further up it lay Beaver and Elk Lakes. Bulkley imagined a dam across the river that would raise both lakes, such as to potentially provide ample water for upwards of 100,000 people. It may be objected, he wrote, that the water of Beaver Lake is not of so pure quality as that of Elk Lake, and that it would be more desirable to take the water direct from the latter. But, he wrote, there are no satisfactory means for effecting this, unless at great expense for pumping, cutting, or tunneling. Again, the waters of both are practically the same, but that of Beaver Lake, having stagnated through a long stretch of willow swamp, has, when viewed in bulk, a slightly peaty tinge. This objection, however, will entirely disappear under the proposal which I submit to you, which provides for the removal of the whole of the willow swamp before the formation of the reservoir, as well as for the construction of headworks by which the water will be filtered before it is emitted into the conduit pipe. As a result of Bulkley's report, the Victoria Waterworks Act of 1873 was passed by the provincial legislature, giving the City of Victoria disposal over all water sources within a radius of 20 miles of the city. In June, the city passed a bylaw allowing it to raise the necessary funds. Work began in 1874. The dam itself was finished promptly. The largest part of the project was building the filter beds that were intended to eliminate, quote, the peaty matter. The steel pipes arrived aboard the British bark Camelot in January 1875. The first water from Elk Lake was delivered to Victoria residents in the fall of that year. Contrary to Bulkley's assurances, the quality of the water from Beaver Lake was, despite the filter beds, problematic from the start. Acting on the basis of complaints from customers, city councillors visited the facility in July 1877. They noted that Beaver Lake had been a swamp before the dam was built and was now, in their words, a bed of ooze and mud and a capital breeding place for the nasty things that find their way through the pipes, into the town, and subsequently into people's interiors. Soon after that, an engineer, W. Bennett, hired by the city to assess the problems and to propose possible solutions, began his report by noting that, quote, want of forethought in the selection of its site, whereby the waters of the clear and beautiful Elk Lake are conducted to the filter beds after undergoing a process of contamination in being mixed with the stagnant waters of what is called Beaver Lake, but which could never have been, and certainly is not at the present time, better than a swamp. The filter beds were altered and enlarged 4 times between 1876 and 1883 with minimally noticeable effect, while demand was constantly increasing. Connections to users outside the city had to be cut off in 1885, and use within the city for lawns and gardens was banned. In 1885, an event occurred which would have a significant effect on the future of Victoria's water supply. That was the incorporation of the Esquimalt Waterworks Company. The company was given rights to the waters of Thetis Lake and its tributaries. At the time, this was not seen as an incursion on Victoria's rights as granted under the Act of 1873. Esquimalt, which included the Royal Naval Dockyard and Hospital, was isolated from Victoria by various bodies of water, and was therefore not being served by the Victoria Waterworks. In 1892, the claims of the Esquimalt Company were extended by Act of Legislature to include the waters of the Gold Stream watershed, which, the company intended to use only for generation of power needed to operate the streetcars in Victoria. In this case, the City of Victoria did object and made a petition to the Legislative Assembly to block the bill. But that failed, and the Esquimalt Company got what it wanted. In the meantime, water pressure and quality remained problems. Elk Lake was only 180 feet above the city, making for less pressure than was needed. Customers at higher levels in the city often found themselves without water. A pumping station was installed on Yates Street, but it did not completely solve the problem. It was estimated that pressure equivalent to a height of 250 feet was the minimum required. Consequently, in 1900, a second pumping station was established on the North Dairy Farm, which is now on Quadra Street at Reynolds Road. This improved the quantity and pressure somewhat, but not the quality. On August 9, 1904 at 4 p.m., a fire broke out in the pattern room of the Albion Ironworks on Store Street. The fire department was promptly on the scene, but a strong southwest wind was spreading the blaze to neighboring properties and across streets, extending northeastward to the corner of Blanchard and Queen Streets, finally destroying or seriously damaging 59 buildings, including 35 residences. Aside from the wind, the greatest problem for the firefighters was the lack of water. The pressure had been poor already on Store Street, but became practically non-existent at the higher levels. Unable to come to any conclusion about the appropriate course of action, Commissioner Raymer urged council to get an outside expert. On the advice of some prominent local businessmen, notably Robert P. Rithett, who had connections in San Francisco, they selected a consulting engineer from that city by the name of Arthur L. Adams. In that same year, Adams would recommend that the city stay with Elk Lake, though with improvements, and consider eventually acquiring rights to the Goldstream watershed. The city then sought to record its rights to Goldstream. But Sooke Lake, which had already been proposed by some in 1894, was still in the back of some minds. Possible routes from there were surveyed in 1906. The Esquimalt Company filed an injunction against Victoria's claim to Goldstream in that same year. The matter went to a provincial court, and the judgment came down in favor of Victoria. Esquimalt immediately appealed the decision to the Privy Council in London, which then, in 1907, ruled in favor of Esquimalt. In the meantime, another large fire occurred in the same area as the earlier one, and the city was roundly criticized by the colonists for its failure to resolve the water issue. Expert Adams was then brought back in. This time he was more favorable to the possibility of going to Sooke Lake. A referendum to authorize raising funds to go to Sooke Lake was put to the voters in 1908 and passed with strong support. The Esquimalt Company threatened litigation because they feared a connection to Sooke Lake would encroach on their rights. As the pressure from Elk Lake was so poor, work was begun in 1908 on a holding reservoir on Smith's Hill, which would be finished by 1909. In 1909, the City Council undertook moves to expropriate the Esquimalt's right to Goldstream. The matter went to referendum and failed. In 1910, another referendum was put to the voters to support a move to Sooke Lake. It failed, so the city decided to try for the outright purchase of the Goldstream holdings of the Esquimalt Company. A referendum on that move also failed. Very shortly after that, the city put another referendum to the voters asking for authorization to go once again to Sooke Lake. This time it passed with a 73% majority. A prominent engineer named Win Meredith was brought in to determine possible routes that would avoid encroachment on Esquimalt's holdings. In the end, he recommended a pipeline from Sooke Lake to a holding reservoir at Humpback, from where water would be brought into the city by a steel pressure pipeline. Tenders for construction were received in November 1911. The lowest bid came from a local company, the Westholme Lumber Company, which had recently built the concrete seawall at the Ross Bay Cemetery. They were awarded the contract. A referendum to pay for the project went to the ratepayers in January 1912. Despite vigorous opposition mounted by the Esquimalt Company, the results of the vote were decisive, with a now 88% in favor. The Westholme Company began work on the 16th of January, but it got off on the wrong foot. They began to build a workers' camp at Humpback, but on land that was designated for the reservoir. When Meredith found out about this, he ordered them to dismantle what they had started and build in a more suitable place, which they did. The tension between the company and Meredith only increased from that moment on. They claimed the plans given them were not complete enough for them to proceed, to which Meredith took strong exception. They said that work would begin clearing at Humpback, and Meredith sent one of his staff to monitor the work, but no one from the company showed up for several days. 3 months into the project, on April 16, 1912, Meredith wrote a long letter to Raymer describing the results of his, quote, careful inspection of the entire work as of this date, 3 months from the date of the contract. The list of deficiencies went on for 8 pages. Meredith concluded, in my opinion, the inevitable result of continuing the work under present conditions will be absolute failure to complete the work within the time stipulated. City Council responded to Meredith's complaints by passing a resolution in April to relieve the Westholme Company of its contract. Offers were received from other companies, but Council had second thoughts. They invited Westholme to meet with them to show them why they should be retained. Then at an in-camera meeting in May, Council decided to restore the contract. Work was resumed, but progress was still slower than had been set out in the contract. By January 1913, Meredith estimated that 38.5% of the total project had been completed, while the contract called for 65% by that date. The clearing around Sooke Lake was still not complete. Little had been done to prepare the dam site. About 19 miles of the flowline grade had been finished, but no trestles had yet been built. Some clearing for the pipe plant at Cooper's Cove had been done, but no pipes had yet been produced. Some clearing had also been done at Humpback, but no work yet on the dam itself. Materials had been received for the steel pipeline into the city, and a plant had been established at Thetis Cove for the manufacture of the pipe, but little had been produced or laid. By March 1913, Westholme was in bankruptcy. In April, Meredith once again recommended to Council that the company be relieved of its contract, which they did. Meanwhile, the water from Elk and Beaver Lakes was becoming so unacceptable that the city was forced to work out a deal with the Esquimalt Company whereby the latter would deliver water to the city by means of a temporary flume and pipeline. Already in 1912, Charles Henry Rust, who had earlier that year been hired as city engineer, assumed the additional post of water commissioner. Around the same time, Win Meredith had hired Boyd Ayla as resident engineer. Rust had been city engineer for Toronto. Meredith had been responsible for building the hydroelectric plant for Vancouver and the one at Jordan River that served Victoria. Ayla had been in charge of the work on the Calabra or Calabra cut of the Panama Canal. All three were, in short, world-class engineers. With men of such caliber at its disposal, it is not surprising that the city decided in 1913 to take over the building of the Sooke Lake system itself and put these men in direct charge of the project. The first thing these engineers did was to hire a number of experienced junior engineers to supervise the work on the site. Among these were Philip Fox, a graduate of Harvard who had worked on railroads and major irrigation projects in Washington State and British Columbia. Harry Crawford, a graduate of the University of Missouri, who had worked on hydroelectric and railroad projects in the U.S. and Alaska. and Charles Pollock, educated in England and experienced on major projects there and in Argentina. By the end of 1913, the clearing around Sooke Lake had been finished. Work on the Sooke Lake Dam was begun in August 1913 and finished in January 1914. The flow line from Sooke Lake to Humpback was more complex. First, the grading had to be finished. A major holdup here was a section just south of Humpback called the Schoolhouse Cut. It was subject to constant slides and not finished until early 1914. Meanwhile, wooden trestles for the railway were built at all points where the flow line grade crossed ravines. 2-foot gauge tracks were laid on the finished grade so that the concrete pipe sections could be transported to where they were laid. In 1914, the contract to build the pipe sections was awarded to the Pacific Pipe Joint Lock Company. They set up a plant at Cooper's Cove to where materials could be delivered by barge. When the pipe sections were ready, they were transported from Cooper's Cove by a cable tramway to the flowline grade, where they were loaded onto cars pulled by small, dinky steam engines toward either Sooke Lake or Humpback. As the pipe sections were put into place, the tracks were taken up and recycled. Concrete trestles were built to support the pipelines at 23 of the ravines. At the 6th, the crossings were made by means of siphons, where the pipeline dropped to the bottom and up again on the other side. Extra heavy pipe sections were used for these crossings. The work on the flow line was finished in May 1915. Preparation of the Humpback site was completed in September 1913, and work on the dam itself was begun. Gravel was brought up by cable railway from a source in the Goldstream Valley just north of Humpback. Coarser rock was obtained from a quarry a short distance south of the site. A wooden trestle was first built from which the concrete could be guided via chutes into forms. The construction of the dam as such was completed by the end of December 1913, with the entire job finished by November 1914. The reservoir was filled from local streams in early 1915 before the flow line was completed. The city worked on the steel pipeline grade, but the building of the pipe, as with the concrete pipe, needed more professional expertise. The contract awarded in June 1914 to the Burrard Engineering Company of Vancouver. The pipeline was completed in February 1915. It was in that month that the first water from Humpback flowed into Victoria, although it was not yet Sooke Lake water. That would come only in May, when the concrete flow line from there to Humpback was finished. In the meantime, the problems of supply adequacy and quality would be a continuing headache for the Water Commissioner, as well as for consumers, until water finally flowed from Sooke Lake in May of 1915. One of the more interesting episodes associated with this shortage occurred in 1914. In March of that year, Commissioner Rust found it necessary to send a warning letter to Mr. H.B. Jackson, manager of the Empress Hotel. He called attention to the large amount of water being used by the hotel. Quote, "During January, the total consumption was 4,530,000 gallons. Excluding the water separately, metered for the laundry, the amount was 4 million gallons, or 130,000 gallons per day, the equivalent used by about 3,000 people. The amount of water consumed by your hotel during January equals the amount used by the combined municipalities of Oak Bay and Saanich. I trust you will look into this matter and see where the waste is." Mr. Rust did not wait for Mr. Jackson to identify the waste. Rust's own agents investigated the matter and discovered that the hotel was laundering all the linen from the CPR steamships, apparently bypassing the laundry meters that the city had installed. Rust wrote to the chairman and members of the City Finance Committee requesting permission to build the hotel for one half the water used over the past 3 years. Why only half? The hotel's management claimed that there had been an arrangement with the city that in exchange for their lighting the causeway in front of the hotel, they would get free water. Rust considered that to be a bad deal and urged the committee to refer the matter to the city solicitor for a report as to the arrangement's legality. By all appearances, the matter was finally resolved with the Empress, but restrictions on water use generally remained in place until May 1915. But there were other incidents during this time that would have an impact on the development of the Sooke flow line. Canada would enter the Great War on the 4th of August 1914, but anticipation of it began much earlier. Already in 1913, Major F.W.C. Bryan, the intelligence officer for District 11 in Victoria, had inquired of the Water Commissioner about aliens working on the water project. In a letter dated the 1st of February 1913, Commissioner Rust wrote Bryan to assure him that, quote, all men engaged at the pumping station and at the reservoir are British-born subjects. The engineering staff, however, at present engaged on the construction of the Sooke pipeline is composed mostly of Americans. But a year later, after hostilities had begun, Rust was less sure. He wrote to Boyd Ayla, the resident engineer, to instruct his foreman to, quote, be very careful where they store their powder, and to place it under lock and key, and be very watchful to see that no foreigners have access to it. Shortly thereafter, he wrote again to Ayla to say that, quote, I notice in the payroll for Humpback you have several individuals with German-sounding names. Are these Germans? If so, discharge them. It turned out that they were not Germans. Rust then assured the superintendent of the provincial police that, quote, I have given instructions some weeks ago that all hostile aliens were not to be employed on city work, and was informed that only foreigners working for the city at Humpback were Scandinavians and Italians. I have, however, given instructions to have this matter thoroughly investigated, and if we find there are Austrians or Germans working, their services will be immediately dispensed with. A few days later, he wrote again to Campbell to say that an inquiry at the Goldstream Hotel had revealed that, quote, there are some Austrians, they think, working up the Malahat. One of the units mobilized to protect the flow line was the Victoria Independent Squadron of Horse, being organized at the time by a Major Walter Bapty. Bapty's unit was sent out to guard the waterworks installations at Sooke very soon after Canada's entering the war. At that time, the unit consisted of no more than 25 men and horses, seen here by photographs taken by American engineer Harry Crawford. They stayed at the city's camp at Cooper's Cove. Commissioner Rust informed Boyd Ayla on the 18th of August 1914 that, quote, the bill for board for the men at Camp 2 is to be sent to Colonel Roy, commanding officer, Work Point Barracks, at the rate of 25 cents a meal. In April of 1915, the Esquimalt Company was notified that Victoria would cease taking water from them effective the 24th of May. The newly completed water supply system was opened by a ceremony at the Sooke Lake Dam on May 28th, with a large number of dignitaries in attendance. The public were notified by advertisements in the local papers on June 3rd that an unlimited supply of water was now available from Sooke Lake, and restrictions on use would no longer be enforced. On June 26, 1915, the YMCA advertised its new water, quote, the best ever. Dive in and swim in it, Sooke Lake water.